Connecticut's manufacturing legacy really goes back. I mean, it really was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and it goes back well over 200 years. So we sort of the DNA of the state is precision manufacturing, but really back to when it started. So if you look at over the years, it's been a critical part of the Connecticut economy.
Welcome to another episode of Made in America. I'm Ari Santiago, President and CEO of IT Direct. Really excited today to have Colin Cooper, who's the Chief Manufacturing Officer for the state of Connecticut, after being CEO of the Whitcraft Group, an aerospace manufacturer in Connecticut, for over 20 years. Colin has a wealth of manufacturing and aerospace experience, and in his new role, a unique perspective and unique ability to impact the manufacturing landscape in Connecticut. I'm really excited to have Colin on to get his views and talk about manufacturing in Connecticut and where we're headed. Colin, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Well, listen, it's the Made in America podcast, so I got to start with the same two questions. What do you make, and why do you make it?
Well, I guess I'm here representing Connecticut. So I make helicopters, submarines, jet engines, medical instruments. I just had a company today that makes equipment, high-speed equipment that manufactures medical products. We have companies that make the machines that make computer chips. You name it. It's probably made in Connecticut.
Made or helped to be made in Connecticut.
Right. Which
is sort of really exciting. And actually, you know, I usually go into the why and the personal why, and I do want to get into that because I think it is an interesting journey you've had to get to the Chief Manufacturing Officer for the state of Connecticut. But I wonder if you're a student of Connecticut history, if you want to opine or have any share about why Connecticut has such a rich manufacturing legacy and why we have such a rich manufacturing future ahead of us as well.
Well, Connecticut's manufacturing legacy really goes back. I mean, it really was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and it goes back well over 200 years. So we sort of the DNA of the state is precision manufacturing, but really back to when it started. So if you look at over the years, it's been a critical part of the Connecticut economy. When I grew up in New Britain, Connecticut, which was called the hardware capital of the world. And at one point in New Britain, probably in the late 50s, before my time, their manufacturing employment in New Britain was up over 70,000 just in New Britain alone. So it's been a big part of the economy. Obviously, we have a lot less people than we did before in manufacturing, but our output is as big as it ever was. I mean, there's obviously productivity plays a role in that.
Productivity, automation, and all that great stuff. We certainly can talk about that in Industry 4.0 and the next industrial revolution. But before we get there, you know, I'm always fascinated about people's personal story. And, we've talked a little bit about it offline, but I think maybe share with the audience, you know, how did Colin Cooper get from the buildings of Medford, Massachusetts, all the way to the state capitol in Connecticut as a Chief Manufacturing Officer? Yeah,
actually, I started in Connecticut. I didn't start in Medford, Mass.
That's true.
You're mentioning that both because we're both spent some time up at Tufts University in Medford, Mass. So I was an engineer up at Tufts, studied engineering, have a BS in mechanical engineering. And came out of school and worked initially as a design engineer for Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford. That was in the early to mid 80s. Went to grad school at Columbia University in New York, got an MBA, and as luck would have it, a friend of mine from Pratt also went to business school at Columbia at the same time. So we were friends before we went to business school and became best friends in business school. And we were both focused initially on on operations. We're both manufacturing or engineering people, and we're going to come out and work in operations. But as he likes to joke, I'm a little more coin operated than he is, and I ended up switching over to finance and then working in investment banking and then in financial restructurings for many years. But got some really good hands-on operational financial experience. Was a CFO of about a half a dozen different companies over a period of 8 years. My business partner, who became my business partner, my friend at the time, went back to work for United Technologies, rotated through various of their businesses, ended up at Sikorsky, and ultimately ended up becoming a plant manager for them, a small facility they had in Bridgeport at the time. And we always thought it'd be fun to own and run a manufacturing business together. So way back in 1996, we started a sort of a structured search to find a company. Really, we're focused on Connecticut. I was living in Westport at the time. He was a little bit living in Middlebury, Connecticut. And we were just amazed at how many manufacturing companies there were in Connecticut. We really had to sort of, narrow down the sample size to a manageable number. We spent a couple of years looking at different companies and found an aerospace business up in the Northeast, in the Quiet Corner in Northeast Connecticut, which was an aerospace manufacturing business. And then we ended up putting together a transaction to buy the business. And we did it the old-fashioned way with other people's money because we didn't have the wherewithal to do it. So we borrowed a lot of money and got some investors to back us and bought the company in 1998. And as we like to say, our timing was perfect. We did a leverage acquisition of a business at the peak of the cycle and then wrote it down. So
perfect.
Yeah. So it was
can't beat good timing.
Yeah, it was a little more exciting than we had anticipated. Look, we couldn't control the external factors, the market, but the things that we were trying to achieve with the business, we did on the schedule that we put forth. The company really didn't have adequate financial systems, didn't have adequate planning systems, didn't have adequate quality systems. So we put all those in. We developed business practices and really worked to improve the performance of the business. And then as the macro environment got better and we sort of deleveraged our balance sheet, we said that, well, that was great. Let's buy another company. And
so let me ask you a question. Listen, John, because I want to get through the story, but I just want to ask while we're on the topic. So it was like a fixer-upper business? No,
it was a nice business. It was a very nice business, but and it really had a great workforce there. But we looked at it, and it was really sort of a confederacy of craftsmen. It was a fabrication business, so the old term you'd use is tin knockers. But these were really skilled people, but not sort of state-of-the-art business practices. So that's what we were so excited about. It was a nice business, but there was so much upside opportunity.
By cleaning up, but so when you looked at it, what you saw was the people, the customers, like what drew you to Whitcraft as the target to get your feet into with the business?
Well, we were comfortable. It helped that we were both from the aerospace industry, so we were comfortable with the industry. But yeah, what they made some really world-class products, but they were using a lot of people to do it. And they had, you'd be sort of climbing over inventory to get from one end of the facility to the other. So we felt that there was a lot of opportunity to better manage production, get inventory out of the process, and then get productivity up. And so ultimately, our goal wasn't to reduce the number of people. The goal was, and which we achieved, was to get more product out with the workforce we have. And then from there, we grew it.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And so when you get in there and you find out, oh wow, the macro cycle, which you can't control, kind of isn't working in your favor, or maybe if it's working completely against you, what'd you guys do to kind of bolster up to kind of see your way through, especially given that you're highly leveraged, you're just getting your feet wet? I think people could learn from that.
Well, we certainly, hopefully we learned from that. We made it through. I mean, obviously you've got to spend a lot of time communicating with your stakeholders. So we had banks, we had investors, and we had customers. And so you have to spend a lot of time making sure that people understand what's going on, sort of the current state of play, but also what your plans are to move the business forward. And so we were fortunate. We had very good communication with our stakeholders. They all were a little restless, but nobody did anything rash. And I think what helped was all the things that we could control, getting the company, putting new systems in, getting ISO and AS 9100 certified, all the things that we had laid out in the business plan that we could control, we achieved on the schedule we did. And then, operationally, you're just looking to, again, take working capital out of the business. I mean, we were using the reduction in working capital to help fund the business during some very difficult times. Not only were volumes down in that time frame, but our customers used that opportunity to extract price reductions.
Yeah.
We joke in its most simple form. There are markets that are part sellers markets or part buyers markets, and that was definitely a part buyers market. And the buyers of the parts use their market leverage to extract price reduction.
So orders are down and they're pushing prices. Yeah, across the board.
Yeah. So
fun. That sounds like a good time.
Yeah, it's funny. We talked in retrospect that if we knew what we knew 3 years into it, would we have done it? And probably we wouldn't have bought the company if we'd known what we were getting in the short term. But again, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Absolutely.
Again, it comes back. We had a great group of people at the company, and the way we were looking to run the business was very different than the way it had been run before. So I think there was initially a lot of skepticism, and you couple the skepticism in a very difficult market, and so we really had to communicate with our associates at the company sort of what we were doing and why we were doing it and what the long-term benefits were going to be. I think there was a healthy skepticism as we came in, especially when you're, Eastford, Connecticut is a town of maybe 1,600 people now. And, here we come in. Like I said, I was born in New Britain, Connecticut. It's the first time in my life I was called a city slicker coming up there. But people stuck with it, and the business ultimately thrived. That is still the core. That Eastford business is still the core of the Whitcraft Group. That facility today employs 400 people, and the output is more than 4 times what it was when we bought it. So
I didn't realize. So it's located in 400 employees, located in a town population 1,600.
Yeah, they pull from a very large radius, and there are a lot of people with the same last names. You get somebody in from a family, and then you end up getting the next generation, the next generation. And again, that's very rewarding.
I was going to say,
when people bring their relatives into the business, it means that you're doing something right. But it's and then we went on, and we over a 20-year period we bought a number of companies. Actually, we bought 10 companies, and really would then overlay into those businesses the business processes that we had developed at the Eastford facility initially, and then really try to drive operational excellence and financial excellence out of those businesses, and we had some success doing that.
So sort of use the same model that you used kind of in Eastford, find businesses that had underlying strength, but maybe had some processes or management that could be enhanced to kind of increase the value of the business. Then kind of layer those together, and all kind of in aerospace. So building one thing on top of the other. Right.
And again, each of those businesses had their core strengths. So you don't want to neuter that, but you want to bring in the business practices that are going to help that business really perform.
So how do you something which, and I know we're going to get to your current role, but what did you guys do to help people that, you'd mentioned before that they were kind of more craftsmen, tin knockers, maybe less systems. And there's a lot of people that we talk to, leaders in manufacturing in Connecticut, that are trying to institute better, maybe overall practices. It could be lean, could be financial practices, could be just a new ERP, whatever. Do you remember, or what you guys did as you acquired more businesses to kind of help get that kind of like old mentality to see the new light and kind of move the business forward?
Yeah, sure. There's always a cultural challenge when you come in and acquire a business. I think our largest one was our initial acquisition of Whitcraft, because we didn't really have a blueprint. We'd put together a business plan, but we were learning as we were going, and you couple that with a market that's got a tremendous amount of headwinds, and people see all these change, but they don't see the net benefit to the business. It was really a war of attrition. We looked at the business 5 years in, and every dollar of profit we had the business at, when we bought it, we'd given back to our customers in form of price reductions, and every dollar of profit we had in the business at 5 years was profit that we had created through better processes, better systems. So, but culturally, it's a challenge. I mean, we came in, the first thing we did when we bought Whitcraft was we spent, which back then was a lot of money for that size, we spent $500,000 putting in information systems, and about a third of that cost was the hardware cost, about a third of that cost was the software cost, and about a third of that was the training and implementations. And people were looking at us, and I remember one comment was, make parts, not charts. Whereas the old owner would never have spent that money on systems, it would have gone into equipment. But our feeling was you need a robust data infrastructure, and better data leads to better decisions, and better decisions over the long term create a competitive advantage. And so we turned the business into a data-driven business. And again, that's not something that happens instantaneously. You know that firsthand. You put a system in, and initially the data you're getting is generally pretty dirty. There's not a lot of integrity to it because nobody's been looking at it. And you need to clean it up. And then when you start getting clean data, then you need to be able to analyze it and take action on it. And all of that takes some time.
Absolutely. Listen, I'm just smiling over here because you're just like singing I have this conversation on a regular basis. Putting in new information systems and new IT systems is more like going to the gym. It takes a while before you kind of can see you got to invest in it. You got to take the time, repeat. And then eventually, to your point, you get that. I don't know how many times I've said good information leads to good decisions, good decisions lead to good business. I mean, that's just where it comes from.
Yeah. And this was a business that made thousands of different part numbers. I mean, it was, it was and still is a mile wide and an inch deep. And so we really needed to be able to collect that information in a systematic way and be able to analyze it. Because if you look at it on a part-by-part basis, you can't see the forest through the trees. Mm-hmm. But again, it takes a while.
Yeah. So how did your role change over time? So when you guys started Whitcraft, how many employees were there?
There were something under 200 employees.
Okay, so it's still a pretty sizable business even at the time. But then you go down. So did you shrink some? Did you lose some staff over the original?
We did. During that first 4 or 5 years, we went down to probably 175 people, I think at the low point, maybe a little less than that. Today it's up over 1,200 people company wide, but yeah, I mean, it was just a function of the environment, the macro environment in the aerospace industry at the time.
And how did your role change from the beginning to over those 20 years? What were you doing early on, and what were you doing more towards the end?
I was doing everything early on. My partner was too. I mean, we literally were doing everything. As a business owner, if the phone rings and nobody's answering it, you pick it up. It's probably a customer. So for me, it was a big transformation when we. I was primarily externally focused. My partner was primarily internally focused. And for me, it was a big milestone when we actually hired a controller for the business, because I was doing all the finance, closing the books, issuing the financial reports. But I also had, HR, I had sales. So I was doing everything, external focus, the customer interaction. And so as we grew and started bringing in professionals on the management side of things, that's when my activities changed somewhat. I was able to delegate, and over time, it was a 20-year process, but over time, we really built out a great management team. And there, again, I've been gone for for a couple of months now, and the business is doing better than it ever has. So, you'd like to think that you're indispensable, but I think if you've done a good job, the business shouldn't miss a beat. And I would say not only has it not missed a beat, it's doing better than it ever has. So,
well, that's a real
we've got
credit.
a good team.
That is credit to the team, and I think it's a credit to the person that hired and put that team together. So, on that front, let's talk a little bit about, as you're going through and you're looking for people to build out your leadership team. And there's a number of manufacturers in Connecticut that are growing right now. And as you're growing, part of what you need to do is find other leaders to help build the business, and you've experienced that. What can you kind of share about what you've learned about how to build that team in a way that's going to be successful to grow the business to be the best it can be?
I think you really, I think you need to understand that you need to go out and get outside people, outside perspectives, and you need to get professionals. The only thing that's certain when you hire somebody is that you're going to be taking on that cost. And a lot of business owners now. Again, you look at most manufacturing businesses in Connecticut; they're between 20 and 30 people. They're not big companies, and so they don't take lightly adding somebody, particularly somebody who's an indirect cost, because they're not creating value that the customer pays for. And so as you're growing, I think for me, the hardest was the acknowledgement that we'd be better off having, delegating some of those responsibilities and having somebody else take them up. And it's a little bit of a leap of faith that's going to happen. But if you hire the right people, it'll work. So I would say, if you're going to hire, maybe overhire. Don't you're not going to go shopping for your brain surgeon based on price or your cardiac surgeon. Same thing with your management team. Really try to get the best people you can. And then we also had some success in some instances taking earlier career people and really stretching them. And that can work out great if you hit on that, and if you do your due diligence. Look, we had some misses. We joked over 13 years, over 20 years, we had, 13, 14 quality managers, so we certainly had some misses. We had some misses in some other areas too. One of the things that we also heard early on was Jack Welch talking about, as he looked at his career, if an area, if he could do it all over again, he had tendency, believe it or not, to hold on to people too long. And sometimes, somebody's working hard, they're trying hard, you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but at some point you just need to make the decision that maybe it's not the best thing for them or for the company to have somebody in a position that's not getting done what should get, or not being accomplished what should be accomplished.
I think that's a hugely important lesson. It's so hard not hard to understand, hard to execute. I don't know. I wonder if you have any insights on making that easier or being able to execute that, because it's always right. It's like you said. You look at someone, they're working hard. Maybe you like them, right? It's just we're not getting the job done. When do you know that line? Do you have any insights on that?
It's hard to be objective on that line. So I was very fortunate. Again, I was in business for 20 years with my best friend. He's very good at what he does. We joked we had sort of overlapping spheres of ignorance. We were good at trying not to step on each other's toes. But there were times if somebody who was in my part of the organization wasn't getting things accomplished, I'd get a nudge from him. He was a bit more objective on what was going on my side of the organization, and vice versa. And so I think that was a big help, having a sounding board like that. Not many business owners have that opportunity to have somebody who's that close to the business, whose interests are exactly aligned with yours, that you can go in, close the door, and hash through some things. So that was a real luxury and a real strength to our partnership.
That really is, actually. That's a pretty interesting opportunity to have that, and I'm a bit envious, I have to say.
Well, we used to joke because there were times we joked. The good news was never were both of us on the ledge ready to jump out at the same time. When I was ready to jump out, he was pulling me back, saying, no, there's so much opportunity, and vice versa. I mean, when the in the early days when the orders weren't coming in, and I back then orders used to get faxed in primarily on a Saturday morning, and I was at work every Saturday, and I'd hear the fax machine going. I'd run down the hall, and I'd be sort of wringing my hands to see what was coming in for orders. And when I was sort of
the level of suspense too, because the fax was like,
yeah, and the total wasn't until page 3.
That's right.
And I'd be wringing my hands saying, oh, where are the orders? We need the demand. And Jeff would be saying, this is great. We've got excess capacity. He's really focused on continuous improvement, and we've really got some resources we can get on some continuous improvement activities. And then there were times where, when it was good and the orders were coming in, and the fax machine was humming, and I'd be dancing the street, and he'd be despondent saying, how are we going to make all this and get it out on time? So, but it really was, for me, for both of us, it was a real luxury having a true partnership. We always say probably our biggest accomplishment over 20 years was that we remained best friends, which is not easy to do.
No, and in fact, absolutely. And that's actually was what I was going to ask you about next. I think there's a lot of people listening to the podcast that are in family businesses, so sort of partners by force or whatever, and other people that have gotten partners either by taking on investors or starting businesses like the way you guys did. I don't know. Do you have any sort of sage wisdom, looking back on the experience? What are sort of the secrets you guys used? And I have to say, I agree with you. I think that the maintaining of the close friendship, and I've seen you guys together and got a chance to meet them and do that, to see kind of how you guys operate. To me, that having that and the success over that period of time, it's inspiration, and might be the 8th wonder of the world. And maybe you could share a little bit on that.
Well, I think it really gets back to we were friends before we went into business together. I think, a lot of marriages, if people are friends before they get married, that's helpful. But I think we had, again, we were both engineers. We both had our MBAs, but his focus was more operational. Mine was more external. And we really tried not to step on each other's toes. So we had our own sort of spheres of influence. They were like a Venn diagram. They did overlap, but look, he understood my world, and I understood his world, and we'd have frank discussions and question. But at the end of the day, ultimately, even if I didn't fully agree, I would defer to him on if he felt strongly on something that was in his area of influence, and he would defer to me. And I think we were fortunate that we had just a tremendous amount of trust and respect for each other. But I think the key is have some clear delineation in sort of areas of responsibility, because if you're overlapping too much, it's inevitable you're going to step on each other's toes.
Did you guys have a meeting rhythm, a neutral third party if there was a disagreement? You guys, I'm just, is there, listen, business people love systems to hold on to, you know what I mean? Yeah. Was there any listen, it's great to be friends and all that up front, but was there any tactical stuff you guys did to maintain the relationship aside? I agree with you, the overlapping responsibilities, but.
Well, nothing that formal. We had lunch every day at the Coriander, which is the one restaurant in East Connecticut. So it's funny, in 20...
You had lunch every day?
Every day, yeah. He and I would have lunch together every day, and I don't miss many. I don't skip many meals, just as a regular practice. But it's funny. Over the course of 20 years, I could probably count on one hand the number of times we really got heated with each other. And there's one instance in particular. I remember we were very animated. To say that we were screaming at each other probably would not be an understatement. In fact, I got up and closed my office door because people were outside were getting a little concerned as we worked through our issues. And being a production facility, we had a bell that went off at 5:12 to say for people can clean up for lunch break, which starts at 12. Well, the bell goes off. We're sort of in mid screaming match. The bell goes off. And we look at each other and says, well, are you driving today or am I driving? I'll drive. Okay. And we went and had lunch and we were able to put things behind us. And again, it was never personal. And again, over 20 years, the relationship really worked out well. So,
can I say, I don't know if maybe you tell me, but something I'm hearing, I just want to maybe pull out and see if you kind of agree as this is maybe a lesson to take away, but it just sounds like great communication. A lot of really great, honest communication.
Yeah. And again, we would go through, I mean, he understood my world, I understood his. We each had an opinion, and we didn't just blindly agree to what the other person said. We would talk it through, and generally we'd come to an agreement on it. But at the end of the day, reasonable people can disagree, and sometimes you just have to defer, and it's like a marriage, right? You pick your battle.
That's right. Know what's what.
Yeah.
So I circle back just a little bit. We talked about hiring the right people, and it's just so important. I want to touch on it one more time. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. I see that manufacturing business leaders seem to have very little, most of the time, very little reluctance to invest in another piece of machinery if they think they're going to get a new line or they think they get some new stuff. But yet they do have a reluctance to overinvest in people. But yet at the same time, they'll tell you, oh, our secret sauce is our people. And I just wonder if you've seen that, if any thoughts on why it's so easy to invest in a thing, but so hard to invest in a person.
Well, I think I wholeheartedly agree with you too. You can see it's tangible with a piece of equipment, right? You know what the specs are on the piece of equipment. You've got a sense for what you're going to pick up, either in terms of capability or efficiency or quality by that investment. Less so with people. The one thing you know is you're going to be picking up the cost. And you hope for the benefit on it. Most in manufacturing in Connecticut, and certainly a lot of the companies we came in contact with, they were family owned. A lot of times people didn't want to bring in people that were going to sort of challenge them. The typical on the aerospace side, the aerospace industry, not just Connecticut, but the supply chain in aerospace is populated by a large number of relatively small companies. Most are privately owned, family owned. We find the management structure is there's a fairly steep pyramid with some benevolent or not so benevolent dictator at the top of the pyramid. We looked at these companies and saw some great companies that would grow to be 30, 40, 50 people and just stop. And we would wonder why. And I think that's about the natural size you can get to where one person can make every decision. And if you're not willing to delegate, then you can't scale. And so these businesses would just get to the sort of the largest organization they could get to, where one person could make every decision. So some of it's just the ownership structure and the desires of the person who owns that business. They're not looking to bring people in who are going to challenge them and push them.
Yeah, but if you want to get past a certain point, you got to do that.
Yeah. No, look, you don't want to get a bunch of yes men around. I mean, we've seen that in companies, and that generally isn't a recipe for success. You want people who are going to push you, and I think we did a pretty good job at Whitcraft of bringing in people who weren't afraid to voice their opinions. You've got to get a diverse collection of opinions on things and sort of hash through to see what makes the most sense.
I could not agree with you more. That's just so absolutely critical. And getting people in who are going to challenge you and challenge the way of thinking to help get those better ideas, right? That steel sharpens steel or iron sharpens iron or whatever.
Right.
How that goes. So listen, let's kind of swing this thing around. You private sector, finance, you went into manufacturing, built a tremendous successful business, had a transition plan all sorted out, got the all-powerful title of executive chairman, a friendly golf and retirement on the horizon, all wonderful things, and then the state of Connecticut knocks on the door and you decide to answer the bell. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we were in a transition plan, and actually, I was out of day-to-day operations, and Jeff was actually my partner was retired by this summer, and then I was approached about whether I was interested in throwing my hat in the ring on this, and initially it was just look, I'm a Connecticut guy. I was born in Hartford. I grew up in New Britain. I live in Glastonbury. Our company's headquartered in Eastford. And I've been in manufacturing, for most of my professional career, and it seemed, I was only interested if I felt that I could have some positive impact. And even in the interview process, I told people, it doesn't have to be me. It just has to be somebody who can get something done here. And I think they had some other good people. I wasn't really privy to the whole process, but I talked with David Lehman, who ran the process. I think ran a fairly robust process. I certainly know when I went through it, I talked to a number of different people, with different stakeholders, different parts of the Connecticut government, and at the end of the day, they made me the offer. It was funny. I joked that at the time I had cut back from 4 days a week to 3 days a week with the expectation that I was going to be retired by the end of 2019. And this is back in October when this sort of reached. They asked me whether I was interested in taking the position. And we had some Viking European river cruise catalogs on the kitchen table, and I talked through with my wife, and at the end I said, all right, well then throw out the catalogs. I'm going to go work for the state. And
Connecticut River cruises still could be in your regular
the Connecticut
future.
River is great.
It is
I
great.
love the Connecticut River. So I started. I finished. At Whitcraft, I retired on October 30th, and I started with the state October 31st.
Didn't even give yourself a couple of days of retirement joy there.
Yeah, and I think in England they call it a gardening leave. I didn't even get a gardening leave. Just the way it worked out, and it's been a whirlwind. So it's been 2 months now.
Yep.
I've spent a lot of time really out in the manufacturing community, meeting with companies, meeting where I run into you and a lot of the industry groups. There's something on the order of between 12.5 and 24 different manufacturing group, primarily large manufacturing groups in the state, representing either different regional areas or different industry areas. And I've really tried to make an effort to get out and meet with them. And that's a great way to, my first. Being the first chief manufacturing officer has been a blessing and a curse. The good news is there's no, I get to sort of create the position.
Do it however you want.
Right. And the bad news is there's really no template to follow. So I really felt sort of my first priority was get out there and try to understand what are the sort of the major issues that Connecticut manufacturers are facing. I certainly knew, from my own experience, what I felt were sort of the priorities or the headwind issues, but I wanted to see if there was a consensus. And having spent 2 months out talking with folks, I think I've got a pretty good sense of what the major issues are and sort of what the priority is. And then obviously you start once you start understanding the issues, then you start saying, okay, I've got to start helping work on the solutions, because after 6 months or so, you start becoming part of the problem if you don't start having some solutions. So, and the issues that we have in Connecticut, look, the headline is manufacturing is alive and well in Connecticut. And some could say it's thriving. It's doing so well that the biggest issue that Connecticut manufacturers have is finding qualified people to fill the positions that they have. By far, the consensus is, workforce development. Every company I meet with, they need people and they need them with the skills. So my biggest focus has been on workforce development. I can come back to that. Other areas, obviously, people are concerned about sort of the tax environment, and I joke that that's certainly above my pay grade. But suffice to say that this administration is really focused on trying to create some tax certainty rather than some of the uncertainty that we've had over the past dozen plus years, or even longer. And they're trying to work with the other constituencies in state government to try to get some control on spending and whatnot to be able to provide that tax certainty, and that's important not only for people who are here, but it's very important for people who are looking to relocate here. They want to sort of know where things are going to be in 5 years, 10 years. So taxes, workforce development, access to capital. That's a big issue. Manufacturing is a very capital and working capital intensive business, and if you're growing, you actually become sort of paradoxically a tougher lending credit when you're going through that growth period.
When you need the money the most, they're the least likely to get it.
Yeah, that's right. I always say banks are great. They'll lend you money, willing to lend you money when you don't need it, and not willing to lend it to you when you do. So that's an important thing. I think if we can find a way to make sure that our growing manufacturers have access to capital, that gives us a competitive advantage. The regulatory environment is a big issue. Regulations is a very broad and all-encompassing term. So when I meet with companies, I ask them to be sort of specific with some things. And then, those are more sort of tactical issues, things that are right here in front of them. On a strategic basis, I think, you'd mentioned early about Industry 4.0. It's folks are in running their business. They're worried about getting that next order. If they've got the order, getting the product made and out the door. They don't really, a lot don't have the luxury of sort of sitting back and saying, where's this going in 5 years and 10 years? And most people running businesses, they've heard of Industry 4.0 and they have some familiarity with it, but they don't fully understand it and what it means for their business. So I think there's a need to help the Connecticut businesses sort of identify the technology that's out there, and then help them with to start to incorporate that into their business.
I agree with you 100% on that. I think to me the kind of the lean, Kaizen movement that took a while to take hold, but really helped so many businesses in the U.S. and in Connecticut in particular in the 80s or maybe more so 90s and the 2000s and even today. And I know Whitcraft's a big believer in all that stuff, and I'm sure it's been a big help to you guys. I think Industry 4.0 is that next frontier where we need to help companies kind of get on that bandwagon and start learning how to take advantage of that or be the companies that get left behind.
Yeah, and clearly it's not an either or. You've got to be focused on lean. Your processes, lean out your processes, and then you don't want to automate an inefficient process.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that you were saying that. I know you know that, but lean is Kaizen, continuous improvement it's got to be a core of any business at any time. It's not a fad.
Correct.
Everything we do in life is a process, and every process can be sort of mapped and improved. Much to my wife's chagrin, when I, Kaizen the coffee making process in the morning or whatever it is, when we have Kanban inventory around the house for things. But anyway,
our wives could probably have a conversation about that.
Right.
So let's just kind of go back through these priorities and maybe we can talk about some solutions, because I think it's important to get there. So we had workforce development, taxes, access to capital, regulatory environment, and then I would say kind of investment in the next technology, the I4.0. So let's kind of get into some solutions a little bit. So, workforce, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, people that have been on the podcast, tons of people we work with, when I ask them what their top 3 business priorities are, many of them will literally say workforce, and workforce, which tells you how important workforce is. Well, anyway, just go ahead. So
the first thing I wanted to get a sense for, what's the size of the hole? What's demand? Mm-hmm. And so I did some modeling using sort of our existing workforce, and we've got about 160,000 people in manufacturing in Connecticut. And I put together a model breaking the manufacturing workforce down in different age buckets, and then making some assumptions on attrition in those age buckets, and then made some assumptions on growth and demand, and then made some assumptions on productivity, which obviously offsets the needs, and came out with a number of 6,000 to 8,000 people a year for the foreseeable future that we need going into the manufacturing
So do you think we could see manufacturing employment in Connecticut crest over 200,000?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. A lot of that demand is driven by attrition. We've got 35% of our workforce is over 55 years old, so a lot of that demand is driven by the need to replace people who are exiting the workforce. I think to get up over 200,000 would be it'd be optimistic to think that we could get there, but.
Can we make that a goal, Colin? That'd be a heck of a legacy for you to leave.
That would be a heck of a legacy. That's a lot of heavy lifting. I think that would be extremely difficult. It's certainly not unattainable. But first of all, you have to have the demand for a workforce of that size, which means that you've got to have about a 25% increase over what today's demand is, just using at the same productivity. And as productivity increases going forward, that's a lot of extra demand. The other is we're just challenged. So my number is we need 6,000 to 8,000 people a year going into manufacturing for the foreseeable future. And I talked with folks over at DOL, and they felt that was directionally correct. They didn't have their own number. And then I asked them again what they see today as open positions, and they don't calculate their own specific number. At least the folks I talked to on manufacturing, they had a range. I spoke with the folks over at CBIA, and their estimate was 8,000 people open positions today. So let's say 5,000 to 10,000 open positions today, with a need for 6,000 to 8,000 people a year going forward. So that's a robust demand for people, and those are jobs that, by and large, a lot of those are created today. So the jobs have been created. We just don't have the people with the requisite skills to fill them. So there's your demand. So then obviously it begs the question: what's our ability to supply that? Right. And you look at the different sources of supply. You've got the technical high schools. You've got some programs now starting up in the comprehensive high schools. You've got the advanced manufacturing centers that are now in 8 of our community colleges. You've got all the way up to 4-year institutions like UConn, training engineers, and you've got sort of non-state institutions, places like Goodwin, who's got a great program that's up and coming, and then outside trainers, people like Porter and Chester and ITT and Lincoln Tech that are training people in specific skills. But when you roll it up together, I don't have a final number. I'm out sort of canvassing now, but suffice to say that it's a fraction of what the demand is. So then you say, okay, where are the bottlenecks in our supply chain? Yeah. And so for different institutions,
Speaking of lean and Kanban,
yeah, in different institutions, it may be different things. In some programs, it may be there's just not enough people have demand going into those programs. They have capacity, but there's not enough people going into them. And some of them, it may be they're oversubscribed, but they don't have the teachers, the requisite teachers they need, or it could be that they don't have enough space or equipment. So I'm really trying to go. I've made it a goal to get out to all of the advanced manufacturing centers to plug in with what's going in the vocational program. I've been talking with folks at some of the comprehensive high schools and try to get a sense for where the bottlenecks are, so that we can try to. And there's a lot of efforts right now going on. There's a lot of regional efforts right now on pipeline initiatives, but I think the state can play a role in trying to coordinate those. And there are efforts going on right now to try to coordinate them. And certainly the governor's Workforce Development Commission, headed by Garrett Moran, is focused on this. So I think the key there is to increase the capacity of our pipelines, of our talent pipelines.
What is the bigger bottleneck? Is the demand, meaning people going into the programs? Is that bigger issue than the programs being able to push them through?
It's different at each institution. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find out for this institution. There maybe I think Naugatuck Valley Community College. I think it's very well subscribed. It's so much so that they're actually looking to put on additional capacity. There's a proposal to build out some space in Western Connecticut State University, so they can expand the program there. They're working with Abbott Tech to put on like a second shift, or have done that. So their bottlenecks may be more physical bottlenecks, space and equipment. Whereas in the eastern part of the state, they've done a nice job building out some at Three Rivers Center there and QVCC. I'll be out visiting them in the next week or two. But my sense there is that maybe some of their issue there is they have the capacity getting the people through it. Other areas I've heard, some of their constraints are teachers. They don't have enough people to teach. So I think it's very much localized. And having not done a full canvas or a full inventory of all these programs, I can't say across the board what's the largest issue. Certainly, demand is an issue. We need to get the word out to younger folks who are at the point where they're trying to figure out what they're going to be when they grow up. That manufacturing is not just a job; it really is a career, and it can be a very rewarding career, both intellectually, in terms of a sense of accomplishment, as well as financially. And we need to get that word out not only to kids but to their parents. Sometimes the parents are the biggest impediment because of outdated perceptions of what manufacturing is about and the opportunities in manufacturing. So certainly demand is a big part of it. Just making sure that kids are aware of what the opportunities are and they get exposure to really what's going on in manufacturing today, because what's really going on versus what people perception is very different. Today I was out at a company, AGR in Bristol, just a world-class facility, and if I were a kid in high school and I went in there, it would just blow my mind. I'm not a kid, I'm not in high school, and it blew my mind. Right. I think just getting folks through those facilities and seeing what's going on.
So as you go through an inventory and you get a sense, of what the problems are, do you already kind of have an idea of what you see as either your specific role and or the state's role in helping to address the issue?
I'm formulating that now. I mean, clearly one of my roles is going to be an advocate to make sure that we get the resources. We need to identify what the resources are. And it's not just money. Some of it may be, working with folks on credentialing for, one of our biggest headwinds in the manufacturing workforce is the fact that we've got so many skilled people retiring. Well, that could be our biggest attribute in terms of faculty, of trainers, because but there are some impediments for them going into teaching. So some of it is just trying to break down those barriers. People talk about the silos, try to break down the silos, get people working together. There's a lot of good work going on in the state, and really, there are a lot of folks that are working, and I can help in this regard, is organize those efforts. But just one thing before we leave workforce I want to touch on is that it's not just we not just need to train people to have the requisite skills to begin their careers in manufacturing, but there's a need for workforce training for incumbent workers. A couple things are driving that. One is when you look at the demographics and you've got your most skilled people retiring, your late career people retiring, even if we can build the pipeline to replace them one for early career people, they're not going to have the skills, knowledge, and abilities. And so it's a fairly significant mix shift shift we're facing in the workforce: skilled people exiting, early career people coming in. So we need to focus on training the people in the workforce, upskilling them, if you want to use some jargon, so that our average skill level doesn't decline as we go through this mix shifts. So that speaks to the need for incumbent worker training, as well as, as we started off earlier, when you talk about things like Industry 4.0, there's a lot of new technology coming on, and we need to train our workforce to work in that environment, to thrive in that environment.
I also just want to put a pitch in here too, which is, I think as we're thinking about building the workforce of the future, I think we need to also make sure we realize that the manufacturing workforce of the future isn't going to entirely look like the manufacturing workforce of the past. And some of the skills, software engineering, software development, application development, data analytics, data engineering, those jobs are jobs that will be needed in manufacturing that maybe aren't as looked at as so manufacturing today. And
yes,
I hope that we're focusing on that, and we need machinists and tool makers and all that 100%. And I'm not minimizing that, but I think we need to be thinking about that workforce of the future and make sure that the Connecticut manufacturing workforce is a state of the art workforce to help lead us, to another 200 years of economic manufacturing prosperity.
Yeah, so. I think the workforce is you want a workforce that are critical thinkers, that are creative. It's not what a lot of people perceive as in manufacturing. And more you're hearing companies talk about they want people not only with sort of some hands-on skills, but can also do some coding. So it's a much more sort of a broad portfolio of skills that you need out of your workforce.
No question about that. So workforce is huge, and I know you're on top of that. I look forward to kind of, once we sort of see an inventory, hearing some of the solutions we're going to put forward, because it's a enormous problem that needs to be fixed, and we could probably spend the whole time talking about it. But I want to move on to some other items. Well, let's just touch on tax. You said it was one of the things, so I'll just touch on it really briefly. You don't obviously have a direct role, in either the tax policy creation, the tax collection, or anything. But what is your role? Do you see as your role in helping to create that important, tax stability and hopefully maybe over the long term some sort of tax relief?
Well, I think the key to getting some tax stability obviously is to constrain spending. Unfortunately, a lot of the programs that have been in place for manufacturing over the past 10 years or so are funded through the bonding process rather than the budgeting process, and so the governor, has little room in terms of, once the budget is set, it's set, but he has a lot of discretion in terms of controlling what's going through the bonding process, and I'm not a student of state government, but it seems to me that some of what would normally be considering operating expenses have been going through the bonding process, and so the government is really working to control those expenditures. That leaves manufacturing a little bit vulnerable because most of those programs are funded through the bonding. So sort of on two minds. I want to make sure that we continue to have the funding that's needed to help support the manufacturing industry in Connecticut. But I think everybody in state government plays a role in making sure that we, live within our means. And so some of the programs that they've had in the past, I think the state is moving away from trying to pick winners and losers and putting money, significant sums behind what they hope to be the winners. That some of the grant programs that are just sort of money out are going to be replaced with different programs that are more sustainable. The state's just not in a position to just sort of be giving away money. Certainly I'm mindful, and I work very closely with David Lehman as commissioner of DECD and the governor's chief economic advisor, and he's very, fiscally focused and has sort of set, he's very much a free market person. So, we don't want to be putting state funds in place of the free market. But we also realize that we're in a competitive environment, that we need to be competitive as a state in terms of the support that we offer manufacturers. But I think most of that support is going to come in the form of investing in things like our workforce. Which is to me is a real investment. I mean, Connecticut, we're never going to compete on being low cost living. We're never going to compete on being the lowest tax environment. Where we need to compete is having the best workforce. And so I think the money that we spend has to be focused on developing and advancing that workforce. And those are all citizens. They're all tax-paying citizens. And those people, well, look, the jobs exist today. They're not filled because we don't have people with the requisite skills. So make some investments so that we can get people to have those skills, fill those jobs, pay those taxes. And every manufacturing job, and you know this, has a very high multiplier in terms of other jobs. So I always say, if you want economic development in the state, let's get people trained to go into manufacturing, because we don't need to create those jobs. They're there today. They're not filled. Right. Let's get them trained and get them into that.
And listen, I just I completely agree with the concept of invest in your strengths and kind of go into your differentiators, because you're going to get more of that. And to your point, if where we can compete and win is on workforce development and having a great and educated workforce, which we already do have a nation leading workforce, doubling down or tripling down on that investment can only pay dividends. So I support that for whatever that's worth, Colin. So let's switch over to kind of access to capital, because I think those kind of things do connect. And how can we continue to make sure that manufacturers, because listen, that is true. And I think there's so many people work and live in the service business, accounting, legal, IT, whatever. I think we sometimes lose sight of how capital intensive it is in manufacturing. And we talked briefly earlier about how the faster you have to grow, the worse credit risk a bank might perceive you to be. So having support for access to capital, affordable capital for manufacturers to invest is critical for that section of the economy to continue to grow. What role can the state play, especially in lieu of the debt diet that we're on? And I think what most business people would support is limiting kind of that credit card use, if you will. How can the state continue to support affordable capital?
Well, so what we're looking at is, as we are in most of the other initiative, is sort of a private-public partnership. So in the past, the state has had for small businesses, has had a Small Business Express program, which was sort of low cost, a limited amount of low cost capital on easier credit terms. But it was often coupled with a grant of a similar amount. Again, the grant programs are not sustainable. So what we're looking at is, can we put together a pool of capital with some public capital, with private capital, put the public capital into the pool on terms that would allow the private capital to take more risk in terms of in terms of their lending policy. We're not looking for
like SBA, like a state SBA kind of.
It's similar to that. I mean, the SBA program is a very good program, but it's also very prescriptive and somewhat narrow in terms of what it'll do. So the analogy I use, if you rated companies on credit worthiness 1 to 10, right? 10 being the best investment grade, 1 being, in liquidation, companies that are 8, 9s, and 10s, they have ready access to capital and cheap capital. Capital's, in my professional lifetime, money's never been cheaper than it is now. But it's the 5, the 6, and the 7s, those smaller companies that are growing, that we want to make sure have access to capital. They need that fuel that capital fuel the growth. But banks have very stringent formulas on where they can lend and where they can't. For their capital requirements. So can we put together a pool of of public and private capital together that would allow the banks to lend to these 5, 6, and 7s. So the bank either gets the return that they need for the risk they're taking, or de-risk it in some manner that the banks
some type of backstop. That's what I was thinking about, kind of the SBA,
yeah.
where the
but the goal is, again, sustainability. It's
Right.
not a giveaway. It's capital. The state doesn't need to make a strong rate of return on it, but we like to see something that replenishes itself and would be ideally available in perpetuity. So
sounds like a self-funded pool that sort of recycles the money.
yeah, I mean, you obviously got to put some capital in to get it going. And it's not a particularly unique idea. So we're in discussions now. We've had a number of discussions with different, in Connecticut, we're fortunate. We've got a good banking system that most of them are active working with small manufacturers, small, mid-sized manufacturers. So they're familiar with it. And so I've had a number of meetings with different banks and bankers and banking groups to discuss this. So at this point, we're sort of working through that right now.
Are you optimistic that there's a solution out there that can be put into place at some point in the not too distant future?
I can conceptualize something that I think would work, but we've got to have more discussions. I'm not fully informed on the constraints that the banks have. So the initial meetings have been, this is what we're thinking. You banks give it some thought, and then let's get back together, and don't tell me what the problems are. Let's talk about how it could work. What would we need to do to make it work?
Yeah.
And maybe the state can do that, and maybe the state can't. But we're very much in discussions on that.
Well, solution-oriented conversations are the way to go. So that's a good place to be.
Yeah.
So let's touch on this regulatory environment, because I think that's something that comes up all the time, right? And I think you're right. Businesses don't even really always know what's a regulation, what's a law, what's local, what's federal. So what are you finding high level in the regulatory concerns, and what can you do about it?
Well, I think the probably the most frequent in terms of sort of regulations you hear are companies struggling with sort of the cost and complexity of environmental regulation. And there are some efforts underway currently that I'm just starting to plug into, looking at some aspects of it. The Connecticut Transfer Act is something that there's been a lot of discussion on, and so I want to plug in that. I have some personal experience with that, having bought a half a dozen companies in Connecticut and having to take them through the Transfer Act. The Connecticut regulations are very different, are different than a lot of our neighboring states. And in some respects, I think there are some advantages to that. In some respects, I think there are some challenges to that. So, plugging into that. Look, I think, most business owners, most people running businesses, they want to do the right things. They're not fire-breathing people with fangs. I mean, they live in their communities. They have family. They have empathy for their workforce. So people want to do the right things, and it's just making sure that our regulation, environmental regulations help them do the right things, but aren't so they aren't overstructured or overly complicated. I know that's a very general answer, but I've talked to some companies on some specific. I'm going back to people and trying to get some specific examples, and certainly there are some things. Anytime something's put into a regulation, it's very black and white usually, and there are some intentions when it's put, the regulations are put in place, but there are always some unintended consequences of that. And so, every now and then you look at a situation and it's a sort of a catch-22. You just can't get there from here.
Right.
And so going back and working with people. But again, likewise, I would say the people who work at Deep, they're also trying to do the right thing. And they want to do the right things. They want to have a thriving economy in Connecticut. So I think people on both sides are well-intentioned.
I'm not trying to pick on Deep, but it's interesting that you're in there now. Like, do you think that that's true? Because I think there's there is some feeling in the business community, merited or not, I think, that there's an like a bad relationship, that they don't feel like people that are in state government necessarily understand the underlying effects of these ideas, and do they are we really marching in the right direction and understand the give and take and the gray nature of the world, not so much the black and white?
Well, look, everybody looks at the world through their own lens and their own experience. So if you've been in state government and you haven't been out working in manufacturing, you're just not going to have the same perspective, and vice versa. I think part of what my role is to be able to communicate to both sides. Yeah, I think the folks I've met with, and I certainly don't, I've got more people I still need to meet with than I have, but the folks that I've come in contact with are trying to do the right things. I think you hit on something. I think, especially when it comes to legislation, I don't think people fully understand the unintended consequences of some legislation. And so the legislation is right-minded and it's trying to achieve maybe some social objective, but people aren't really aware of the unintended consequences of that and the real world challenges that presents. And I think, in the business community in general and manufacturing specifically, I think there's a frustration that in the past, some legislation or initiatives have been put in place without really thinking through what that's going to mean to the people who are, employing 11% of our workforce here in the state. So
I don't think that can be understated, and just how important it is that message does kind of get through. And I think, in most cases, right, most people are looking to do the right thing most of the time. So usually when there's a gap, it's a gap in understanding and a gap in communication. And maybe there's an opportunity to kind of meet somewhere and really break down those barriers by having, people kind of get an opportunity to kind of walk a few steps in the other person's shoes, to see what's going on. Because I often do wonder about is there really that depth of understanding that there needs to be kind of on both sides of the fence.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, again, it's unintended consequences, and so just making sure people understand the things that they're advocating, what the full impact is going to be on other constituencies.
Yeah, no question. And actually, I do have one question. One of the things that comes up regularly when we talk about regulation, and same with taxes and everything, there's always a comparison with sort of neighboring states, and I wonder if that's like a crutch. And maybe we're just going to be opining some general conversation here, but like, why does it matter what Rhode Island's doing? Shouldn't it just matter what the right thing to do is?
Well, I think you do need to look at you need to look at what other states are doing, because the Connecticut is in competition with other states for businesses, for growth, and business owners have choices in terms of, just like residents have choices on where they're going to live. So you really need to look at your policies and your situation relative to other locations, because you're competing with them for that. So I do think, I don't think business owners take lightly. You don't take lightly the thought of relocating your business, but that's, we see that happen. And also, particularly if you're looking to recruit businesses into the state, they're weighing their options. So I don't think you can get away from it. You really do need to look to see. I agree. You want to do the right thing, but everything's in context, and you need to, and sometimes some people are doing things that don't make a lot of sense, and you're going to make the decision, look, that's crazy. We're just not going to try to compete with that. But at least you need to know what they're doing there. So I do think we need to look at things in context, but I agree that at the end of the day, we need to do what's right for this state.
Yeah, and I'm always a fan of, like, let's lead the way, right? So if we want to make an environment where advanced manufacturing can thrive, where we've got the globally best workforce and the best environment, let's just start making decisions, man, based around those ideas and those goals, and set that horizon, and make that mark, and make that decision, and move in that direction.
Yeah, all decisions are no decisions are made in a vacuum, though, right? I mean,
That's
and
right.
again, so what I'm learning is is there are decisions that are made with some political implications because the lawmakers are politicians, and so you've got to work within that environment and those
and that democracy has those constraints,
yes,
right?
yeah,
Doesn't it?
yeah.
So got to take the good with the bad.
Right.
So listen, before we get to our rapid fire round of questions and wrap this up, I just want to ask kind of your overall take. I mean, 2 months is not that long in, but I just what's your take 2 months in? Having gone through the process and taking this task on with the idea that you really, and you've said it before, and I admire it so much. You didn't need to do this. You did it because you wanted to make an impact. So 2 months in, do you think this position is set up in a way that it will be able to make that impact you wanted to make when you set out?
I think it's critical to have somebody inside a state government who comes to work every day focused on what can we do to help manufacturing thrive in the state. I think that's an important it's an important position. I'm not saying it doesn't have to be me. I just think it's important. I think it's important to the manufacturing community to know that they have an advocate there. So look, I'm optimistic. I mean, when you say your biggest problem is workforce development, that's a high class problem. I've been around in manufacturing long enough. 20 years ago, when there just wasn't a demand for people, that's a whole different set of challenges that we have a lot less control on. We have, the manufacturing business have done their job. They've gone out and created the demand, and they've created the positions. Now, we need to work with them to make sure that they have the people, and it's not just doing it for them. It's doing it for the Connecticut citizens. I mean, we have 9,000 high school kids, graduates a year that go to comprehensive high schools that don't go on to post-secondary school education, and a large number of those are going to be what people would term underemployed. That's a lot of skill. If we can tap into that river of talent that comes out every year and get people trained and into manufacturing where they have careers, that's exciting. It's not just good for the manufacturing company, that's good for the state, and it's good for the people.
Oh, it's good for those people, it's good for their families, good for the communities that they live in.
And it's good for the 2 to 3 to 4 jobs that they create, depending on whose multiplier you use.
That's right.
So look, it's a challenge, but in the, if you look at sort of pantheon of issues, that's a high class problem to have.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. And I agree with you. It's amazing that we have a state that's decided to put up someone in the position that you have to put manufacturing at the table. I think it's very encouraging for manufacturing. And I think it's a credit to the manufacturing community that we have you up there advocating for us. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, thank you.
All right, man. You ready for some rapid fire round of questions? I started telling people there are right and wrong. So
you softened me up for an hour, and now you're going to hit me with
that's
rapid
right.
fire questions.
Here we go. All right, here we go. Ready? Red Sox or Yankees?
Red Sox.
See, I knew I liked you. Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts?
Dunkin' Donuts.
Ooh, staycation or exotic destination?
Staycation. I'm a Connecticut guy.
iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Sports car or SUV?
Both.
Yeah, there you go. If you had to do something other than be the chief manufacturing officer for the state of Connecticut, what would you do?
Well, I'd probably be retired right now, but I don't think I'd stay retired long. I'm still trying to figure out. I think I'd be a teacher.
Yeah,
I think I'd be a teacher. That's an itch I've always wanted to scratch. It's something I was looking into. I like working with young people, and I like being able to help impart some of the lessons I've learned over my lifetime.
What subject?
As much of a disappointment as this may be for some, I would probably be economics and finance.
There you go. What's your favorite business book?
Oh, geez. Boy, if I don't say lean thinking, my business partner is going to have my head. So we'll leave it at that.
All right. And that's understanding how to navigate a marriage. What's one thing, Colin, that you learned early in your career or early in your life that you think helped propel you to all the success that you've had?
No substitute for hard work. I always admire people who are wildly successful who don't work hard. And I've always said I'm not smart enough to be successful without working hard.
What's one thing you learned later in your career, later in your life, that you wish you could go back and tell young Colin that if he listened to, it would really help propel him?
Well, I think that I learned when we were sort of in the slog of owning the business that, and again, I learned this from my business partner, sort of how you spend your days is how you spend your life. So make sure you're enjoying your days as you go along.
Wow, that's really great. That's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for that. And listen, the last thing I like to talk about is we've been through a lot. We've talked about a lot. You've had a whole career and then a new one we've talked about. One of our big goals in the podcast is to leave people with something that they can learn and walk away from. So I'm curious if someone listened to this whole podcast and they could walk away with one thing that we talked about today, that if they implemented that or took it to heart, you think it'd really make an impact in their life. What's something we talked about today that you think could meet that bar?
Well, as a business owner, it took me a while to learn that probably your best investment is in your people. So, and that's something we need companies in Connecticut to do, is make sure that they're investing in their people, and the rewards, again, it's like you said, it's like going to the gym. You may not see it right away, but over the long term, you're going to be a lot better off for it.
I completely agree with that. And from my end, something that came up kind of early on, but talking about your relationship with your partner, Jeff, that I thought was so interesting, which is this constant communication. I think really kind of having that communication, and you joked about the lunch, but thinking about it in my own experience, having that regular cadence of check-in communication where you're just always scheduled to talk. So you build that relationship, to build that level of trust that allows you to kind of sustain over the long term. I think that's such a powerful thing that not only helps in business, but can help in the personal life too. And I think that's a great lesson people could take from our conversation today that I think would really positively impact your life. I'm glad we had a chance to share that.
All right, great. Well, thank you.
Colin, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a heck of a time getting to know you. I'm sure I'm going to see you around the circuit some more, and I look forward to having you on again on the podcast later on when we have some accomplishments to share from your new role. All right?
All right, ratchet up the pressure.
There you go. Thank you again so much.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by IT Direct.
As always, thanks so much for tuning in. I definitely want your feedback and hope you subscribe. But what I want the most is to build a community where we learn and grow with each other. I hope you're getting a lot of value out of the time we're spending together. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.